first thing we did was pray when we got the knock on the door. It's like, it's my husband and I said, well, where else would we go but to God? There's no place else. There's no way you can do this without God's help.
Welcome, my friends. Last week, we heard from Angie, Clayton, and Jackie Baker tell their two very different stories of adoption. If you haven't listened to that yet, go back and check it out. Have you lost someone to suicide or drug overdose? Perhaps not, but we've all had someone in our lives die, and we've each grieved in some manner. Birthdays, holidays, special occasions all trigger our grief. In some cases, we face regrets or somehow blame ourselves. Today, we'll hear from Angie Clayton and Jackie Baker, who both have stories which have brought them to counseling and be there for people in their time of grief. It's a hard subject, but stick with me, because I believe you'll go away with comfort and ideas to deal with grief yourself and to stand beside others who grieve.
I have guests today, Jackie Baker and Angie Clayton is joining us as well. Both of these wonderful women have worked with grief in two different types of areas. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And then they both have adoption stories. So we're going to get into a little bit of that today. So let's get started. Welcome, Jackie.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Welcome, Angie.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be back.
Great. Well, I'm going to start with Jackie. Jackie, tell me about your son, Sebastian. What was he like?
So Sebastian was my firstborn son, and he came out big, 9 pounds, blonde and blue-eyed. And I was like, did I give birth to this kid? Because I had brown hair, brown eyes, and out comes this huge little blonde hair. I called him my Buddha boy. So he came squawking right out at the very beginning and very strong-willed, curious, smart as a whip. He kept me on my toes right from the very beginning. Started playing chess when he was 7 and became a national chess champion when he was 9. And so, just this brilliant young man that my goal was always just to try to keep him busy. Because I always learned if I didn't keep him busy, he was going to keep me busy. So I was just going to. So that was Sebastian. And then a soccer player, played soccer, did really well in school. And then around 8th grade, then he's decided didn't want to play chess anymore. He started changing and just was struggling with identity and who he was. And he graduated, went off to college, played soccer, got a soccer scholarship, went to Northwest Nazarene, and then came home from college and said, I'm not going back. And so we noticed some things changing in him. Suffered with depression, anxiety, became manic-y, probably, was diagnosed with bipolar. And but through it all, he did love Jesus. He accepted Jesus when he was like 10 years old and was baptized, but just had some struggles that he would say his brain, he couldn't keep up with his brain. He would always tell me that, Mom, I don't know why my brain thinks this way. And so we spent a lot of time talking about deep thinkers. Always got him books that he could think about, John the Cross, Augustine, John Foster Wallace, David Foster Wallace, things like that. So, but he was just a brilliant young man. And then, but when he was 23 years old, he was in rehab for some poor choices he made with drug use and stealing. And he was facing jail time or rehab. And then it was in rehab that he had his first suicide attempt. And he was sent to another place where he could get medicated. And then 6 months later, then he had a second suicide, and he died in September of 2017. So almost 7 years ago. So that's my boy. That's Sebastian. Yeah.
Boy, hard to watch. With any of our kids, it's hard to watch when they're going along, bumping along, and then some of them just kind of like get this little veer off, and it's just like, trying to drag him back in. And
Right. Always had hope because I kept thinking, Sebastian, you just got to get through this. You got to get through this. Got to lean on the Lord, and trying to always try to be positive for him. And I did a lot of praying, but it just came a point in my life where as a mother, you can only do so much. And especially he was a young man, 23 now. So he was, an adult out of the home and wanted to come home, but I didn't let him come home because of the choices he made. It just wasn't a safe place for him to come to our home time. And so he didn't, but we always talked. In fact, the day he died, our last conversation was, "I love you, Mom." And I said, "I love you too," and little did I know that, a couple hours later that I would get a
to
knock.
hold on to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we always knew that. And we always used to tell each other, "We love you." Yeah.
Yeah. Thinking back, did you feel guilty because you didn't let him come home?
Briefly, I thought about it. A wise person said, it was interesting because he said, if you had brought him home, he could have died at home, and I didn't think about that, but when I said he couldn't, I couldn't because, yeah, he had made some choices and he had stolen from me. And my husband said, it's bad when Mom says it's time to leave. And he had been stealing money from my debit card. I never changed my password. And one day I noticed money, I was withdrawn. And so I confronted him, and this is before I kicked him out. And asked him, and he said, yeah, I took your money. You might want to change your debit card number. And I was like, okay, all right, then I'm done. I mean, that's where he was,
Yeah. Yeah.
He was just, I don't excuse his behavior. It was not, I don't make any excuses for it at all. He made some poor choices, and I just couldn't bring him home because of that.
Right. And you made the best choice that you should at the time,
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it killed you. I mean, literally, it was hard. I mean, I think about that, and I was like, no, it was the right decision to make. I mean, maybe someone might not agree with it, but for us, it was, yeah.
No, and I think too, it was God's protection for you, in a lot of ways.
Because I have interacted with mothers or that have found their children, and that's something that would be awful too. Yeah, I think that God saved me from that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that'd just be, oh my goodness. And so when things like that happen, your first question is like, why God? But it's like, how did you deal with that? Where did you see God in the midst of this?
Through it all. Well, he was, of course, the first thing we did was pray when we got the knock on the door. It's like, as my husband and I said, well, where else would we go but to God? There's no place else. There's no way you can do this without God's help, because I always say it's one of the lies is that God gives you, he doesn't give you anything you can't handle, but you cannot handle this. You cannot do this on your own. You need support, and you need support from people, from God. And I always said, I remember at the funeral at our church, the sanctuary was filled. There must have been at least 600-700 people there. And there was a line, and all I kept thinking was, people would say, you don't remember, but you did this for us, and you did this for us. And all I kept thinking was back in Revelation when God said, there'd be no more tears. I go, this is what heaven is going to be like, because there's just going to be no more tears. It's just, we were just felt so lifted up by the body of Christ. And that was just the only way. I mean, I have no memory of the first few weeks, of what happened, but I do know that I was carried through it, and so that was the only way. I mean, and I cried to the Lord all the time, just, in grief and pain. And the Psalms were a lovely place. They're filled with laments and, why God, why God? But it's always to God. When we pray, it's always to him. And he doesn't give us, what I just remembered is that, but God watched his own son die on the cross. He knows how I feel. I mean, he of all people knows exactly how I feel. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, even more so because it was so brutal.
Right. Yeah.
You know, I mean, even if we watch our kids getting bullied and whatever, your heart is hurting.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah. But to have something like that is, yeah.
Mhm.
So you have moved into an area working with women who have lost children through suicide. Tell us about that.
Well, it was within like weeks after our son died. I got a call from someone whose son had attempted suicide, and it was just this surreal place. They're like, "Well, can you help?" Gosh, I just got through this. I mean, I'm not even through this. I'm still in it. And I we've so that was just like a couple weeks later, and then like a month later, I had another friend that said, "Hey, so and so lost their husband and child to a tragic accident. Would you meet with them?" And again, I was just like, "Oh, if I, okay, Lord, only." So then I started meeting with this woman, and then once again, someone said another friend of ours had died. Their son had died, and would I call them? So all of a sudden, people just started calling me, you know, out of, when looking back on it, it was kind of, they didn't know who else to call. Yeah. Who do you call in a time like this? And they're like, "Well, Jackie's been through this, she would know." And back then I didn't know. I mean, I always used to say, I'm just one step ahead of you, because I'm still trying to figure all this out. And so I just started walking alongside women, mothers, and I would just sit and cry with them, and we would cry together, and we would pray together, and mourn together, and just, you know, talk about, I always say, stupid things people tell you, when you're like, "I can't believe you just said that to me," but we always talk about writing a book about things you shouldn't say to people when they lose someone to
It's a book
suicide.
that has some of that in it, right, Angie?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. But yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, my friend that lost children to suicide and I have this little saying that people are stupid, right? I mean, they mean well. They mean well
Right.
because they just things come out before they
I know.
impact.
Yeah. But yeah, so that's where I started. And then, so over the years, and then I started writing, and that's where my writing, I used to write before, but I started writing in my grief. And then I would started sharing my grief story on my Substack, and essays, and just sharing with people. And then I just really felt compelled. I wanted to find a better way to help other mothers and who lost children to suicide. And so I started a support group at church that's just in its infancy stages right now. But I meet with a couple gals who have lost someone, not a child, but other family members to suicide, and just that common thread, of just a safe place to talk about grieving a suicide. I have found that it's different suicidal grief than similar to traumatic grief, but there's a lot of the things that are different are, if someone dies from cancer, people are walking alongside them. We know it's coming, they were brave. If there was an accident that happened, it was tragic, but they lived a good life. But then when someone dies of suicide, you're like, no one knows what to say, right? Because you have a lot of things, but no one knows what to say. And if they do, they don't say it sometimes very well. And so that's what I started thinking about, because the grief is complex. And I think you're going to talk about that as well. There's a lot of guilt and a lot of shame, because there's the what ifs. And could I have done something? I should have been able to do something. I should have been able to know, and so there's a lot of unanswered questions that people feel like they need to try to find the answers, and they can't. So that's where it came from, is just letting people that the grief process takes longer, that there is no timeline for when grief ends, because people think after a year you should be done, right? And we're like, well, no, you're just almost just beginning. I find what I noticed that for me is, like, after the first year, the numbness starts going away, and then you start feeling all those things that I think God protected you the first year. because you were numb and you didn't remember it. All of a sudden you're like, why is it worse? It's that the body grief is coming out because you're starting to feel things again, and it hurts even more the second year around, I think.
I think you're right. I've touched so many people that have said exactly what you said. The second year's harder. The anniversaries, the holidays, all of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are things that, in your working with other women going through this, are there, do you ever come to some resolution or something that helps you understand? Are there certain things over others that help you understand how this could happen, and maybe that it wasn't your fault, or I don't know.
And that's every family is unique, and how they deal with it, or what they discover. Like for us, I knew once a child that has a suicide attempt, then the risk factors are higher that they will attempt again or be completed. Of course, boys are more likely to complete a suicide statistically than get completed by, kill themselves, than a woman. The fact that our son had already had one unsuccessful suicide, the risk factors had gone up higher. And it comes to a point where I found where I just had to let him go. And I'm still going to help him. We got him into rehab. Found him a psychiatrist, but I can't control what he's going to do all his life, and I think that's the hardest part, I think, for moms is we want our children to be safe always, even our adult children. Right. But there's no guarantees in life, and we're all going to die. We didn't, the trajectory was your child wasn't going to die this way. It was going to die from old age after we're gone. Right. No one wants to bury your own child. So, yeah. So I find for us, once Sebastian died, it was almost a relief. Our suffering was, of course it changed, but we no longer worried about him anymore. I knew he was safe because his pain was gone. His suffering was gone. And I used to be really ticked. I'm like, well, he's better off than I am right now. And I remember after his first attempt, and I was in the ER with him, I was so mad. I had, and I don't know if it was right or wrong, but I was just really angry because he had the rope marks around his neck were raw from, the rope broke. He was missing for 24 hours after, and then he was finally found and was admitted to a hospital. And I was just like, Sebastian, I go, but when you die, I go, you leave me behind. You're good, and I am going to be hurting like hell. It was just, and I was like, I don't know if that was the right thing to say, but I was just
but there is no right thing to say.
Yeah. I was so mad.
You're coming from the depths of your broken heart.
Yeah. And he was just, he was just like, whatever, because he was so sick mentally, it was just so mentally distraught that he couldn't go there. But yeah. So that answers that question, but it just, I think for when he finally passed, it was almost like, oh, I can breathe better at night. Because I have friends whose sons are still struggling with different things, and, they don't know sometimes if they're safe or not. And I have that, at least I have that assurance to know he's good. Yeah. Yeah.
I think the other thing, and I haven't lost anyone through suicide. My niece was a heroin addict and she overdosed. That's the closest I come with that. And even still knowing and trying to get help and trying to do whatever you can, you can only do so much. And I truly believe that nobody commits suicide who is mentally healthy.
No.
They're in a place where that seems like the only way to stop it.
Often, I'm not going to speak for Sebastian, Jackie, but often what I see is that the decision was an instant, terrible decision, and the consequences were life-ending. But it was one probably of a series of terrible decisions. The kid or the young adult usually has made, and this one was just the last one.
Yeah, we have a friend who's a palliative care doctor, and she called what Sebastian was going through was like how'd she call it? Like it was a mental health cancer. She called it a cancer of the mind, and that it was terminal, and she said, of course, we're always going to try and help and the chemo of whatever, but she said, sometimes we have to look at it that way, and that is kind of, in a way, it is kind of reassuring, like, oh yeah, this, but there's always still, you always hope that something, that all of a sudden this miracle is going to happen and they're all better. Right. But, it doesn't always, of course it doesn't, there is no guarantees in life, except for that God is good, that's what I always tell people. And through it all, God remained good and present. And my husband and I would say that, well, we both know this. We have grown closer in our faith since we've lost our son. I haven't seen that a lot. I mean, but we just clung to him. And I always said grieving would be easier if it was just me, and not my husband or my child, because we all grieve differently, right? And we just,
Right.
and like, and having to learn to respect the way other people grieve in your family. And it can be frustrating at times because I'm like, well, I'm grieving. How can you be grieving? Like, wait, we're all grieving,
Right.
Yeah.
You know what? That's
Oh, go ahead.
really good. She said it's a really good point. And men and women grieve differently. Extroverts grieve
Oh,
differently. There's a million reasons why we might do it differently from our spouse. And it
Mhm.
is really hard. Why am I wailing and crying and can't stop? And you're sitting over there on your phone, or whatever. Those are extreme examples, but you know what I'm saying? And he's grieving just as hard as I am. It just looks different. But being able to respect that, to recognize it for what it is, and which is grief, and respect the differences. It's so good.
Yeah. And then over the years, on the anniversary, we call the anniversary is the day our son died. We call it his homecoming anniversary. That's what we call it. And we always take a trip. So that's something that we've done too. It was a way that the first couple years was, I just didn't want to be home. Right. I just didn't want to be around. And now it's come, we're on year 7. And now it's like, okay, where are we going on the anniversary trip? So we always take off 2 weeks in September and we go someplace fun and new and do something different. And even last year we went to Sedona, Arizona. That was fun for a few days with my daughter, Sebastian's sister, and my husband. And we cried for like about an hour talking about how our grief has been for this last year or this past, how it's changed, how it's morphed. And then we went hiking and laughed and, we can tell the stories more fun about Sebastian now. Because over the years, it was so hard to see who he was outside of what he did, and we forget because people like, oh, oh, your son committed suicide, but he was more than,
Because that defined him.
yeah, yeah, does not define him. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's just the last thing he did. I mean, it
Right. Yeah.
doesn't even say much about who he is.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so I always like to, because people are always, I always call it lobbing the hand grenade, because people will say, so how many children do you have? And then you're like,
How do you
yeah,
answer that?
yeah, how do you answer that? And I wrote a whole essay on it, all these different ways that you can, answer that. And most of the time we used to try to avoid even, answering that by deflecting. We got really good at changing the subject really fast or talking about someone getting married and, and avoid that because it does get awkward. And now my husband will be in a room where like, oh, these people don't know, and then we just kind of, then we have our game plan in place about, what do we say or how do we say it, but it's gotten easier over the years. Now we just say it. But those first 3 or 4 years, it is awful you just hated going anywhere.
Because
Did you-
Well, yeah. And I mean, it's not just that I have one living and one not living,
Mhm.
right? It's way more complicated than that. And
They want to know what happened.
exactly, what do you say? What do you not say?
All
And,
right.
I know you, I'm not going to tell you this about myself. And yeah, very, very complicated.
Yeah, it is. And that's what I notice about suicidal grief. Well, it's complex and it's not all grief is complex, but there is something unique about suicide. And even still in our culture, even though it's like 1 out of every 11 young people die, a day from suicide. I think it's more like 11. Yeah. 1 in 11. Yeah. Die a day of suicide. That there's still the stigma about it, even in the church, still, even though I would say most churches don't believe that. The Catholic Church denounced it. It used to be, you'd have a separate burial place. They couldn't be buried but even
What would you say to someone who was newly in this situation? What could you say to them?
the tendency is to isolate and which is, I think you need a period of isolation, but you also need to be taken care of. I think, we talked about, the Elijah when he was out in the desert and God cared for him and fed him. And I learned to say, when people asked if they could do something, I learned to say yes and allowed people to care for me because I'm a pretty independent person. I think most women are, we can do it, right? But I found I couldn't do it. And my husband was like, if people say, can they bring a meal? You say yes. I'm like, okay. Because you just don't want to bother people, right? And you're in your grief. We're still caregivers. But I just learned to say yes a lot and just allow people to care for me,
And for those of us who are on the outside, right, of the grief, but we want to care for you well, sometimes it's more helpful to say, I'm going to bring you dinner this week. Which night is best?
Right.
Because that's an easier decision to make. It's an easier yes, maybe.
Right. Because you just don't know. You can't think about, I don't know. Because a lot of that is, I just know. What's a good night? I don't know. I didn't know.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, so I'll bring a meal. And like, if I really appreciated when someone said, oh, I'm going to drop by a meal on Wednesday, I was like, thank you, or, what did someone, it was so funny. I wanted on Facebook, I ordered, it was taking an old TV stand and making it into a hutch. And I just remember thinking, I need someone to pick that up. And then all of a sudden someone went and picked it up and brought it. And, but I just let that need know. But it was just little things like that, that because life was still going on. Right. But it was really, it was so great the way people just cared for us and, and just did things and thought for me. I needed someone to think for me, safe people to think for me.
Yes. Yeah. And to do that, to be able to think for you, with you, around you, I have to get in close to you, right? I can't stay on your doorstep. I have to put my planet in alignment with your planet, which is a grief planet. And I got to come in.
Yeah.
If I can help you, I have to come in.
Right. Yeah. And that was like with my friend who lost her husband and son in a tragic accident. And I said, I think it was just like 5 months after Sebastian died. So I'm still, and all we did was, I'm like, okay, I'll come over. I didn't feel like I could contribute anything, but that we had the shared trauma, of losing, I hadn't lost my husband, but, just losing, a son and just recently, and we would just cry together, just allowing me to cry in a safe place and not worrying about, whenever we cry, don't we always say, sorry. But just, I would tell people I'm in a season of crying. I'm going to cry. So just know that. I used to tell people that all the time. I'm just going to cry. Cried at church, cried everywhere.
I started crying about the time I started walking along with these really broken, grieving women. I started crying all the time and I have not stopped. So, I cry in church every Sunday. I never used to cry, but there's just a tenderness that has come up in me, I guess, that won't leave.
My husband, same thing. He cries every Sunday at church, every Sunday for the last 7 years. Yep. Yeah. There's a tenderness there that I've not seen. He's always a sensitive guy, but even more, Yeah.
Yeah.
I just got to say, Jackie, I love hearing you talk to him.
And he is Lord of all and Lord over everything, even our darkest places, and we have to let him into those dark places.
When I was 30, my husband was diagnosed with a brain tumor. We had 3 kids, and it was just something to go through when you're young. And I had never really been around anyone who had died before or had a major illness. He went into surgery and ended up coming out of the surgery being paralyzed on his right side. which meant, of course, that he couldn't work anymore and he couldn't drive. And for a guy, that's pretty hard. So walking through all of that, he spent 21 days in the hospital. And let me tell you, it wasn't all that easy. But I can't think of a time in my entire life where I've been closer to God and felt his presence so realistically. It seemed like it was a time to really totally depend on him. And God showed up all the way through. You can read about that more in my memoir if you're ever interested. It's called I Will Enter His Gates, and it's based on my husband Howard's spiritual journal that he left that told all about what God was doing with him in the midst of this. So, you want a little encouragement, that's a place to go. My big takeaways from this episode are going to God first, even if it doesn't seem fair, even if you can't understand it. Trust that God sees you and loves you and has his arms ready to wrap around you. Take as long as you need to grieve. There's no timeline that has to be met. Say yes if someone wants to offer you help or meals. They are likely grieving as well, and it's a way that they can walk beside you. And sometimes we need to just sit with someone, and that's enough. In episode 11, if you missed that one, Angie Clayton shares her story of walking beside a friend whose child died by suicide. She wasn't sure what to do, but in the end, she sat with her and just grieved beside her. This started her on a journey of blogging and helping others through grief from the outside. You can find her links in the show notes, as well as Jackie's. Friend, if you or someone you know are grieving and you need someone to chat with, contact me, or Jackie, or Angie. We'll be there for you. No one should grieve alone. So a book I'd like to recommend this time is Divine Detour by Lorianne Wood. The path you wouldn't choose can lead to the faith you've always wanted. A serious medical diagnosis took Lorianne Wood on a faith detour she never saw coming. As a lifelong believer, she felt profound disappointment in the God she thought she knew. Divine Detour is the result of Lorianne's risky decisions to embrace difficult questions. Is this life all there is? Is God always good? Is God's plan enough? Come along on a 40-day journey deep into the heart of a God who often doesn't behave as we'd like. You'll learn to embrace the 3 questions every life encounters so your faith can thrive along your own inevitable detour. A podcast I've been listening to that I think is pretty great is called The Love Offering with Rachel Adams. She interviews people who love God and love people well. Her vision is to encourage and embolden a generation to do something to manifest a better world that we want to see. So I would love it if you would share this episode. If you have somebody that you think would really benefit from this, please hit the share button and let them know. And if you haven't signed up for my newsletter yet, you might want to do that because it has just more links and more information in there, which is also another thing that you can share with other people. We just want people to know about God and what God is doing in people's lives and how he can be in your life to make a difference. So I'm going to leave you with these scriptures. Isaiah 53:4. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Psalm 147:3. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. Revelation 21:4. God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, no sorrow, nor crying. There should be no pain, for the former things have passed away. Thanks for joining me again this week. I really, really appreciate you guys, and I hope that this podcast is a blessing to you. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next time.